Hello, I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar. Welcome to Superhero University on Wonder Woman Rebirth, Year 1, a little ditty about Steve and Diana. Have a seat. Class is now in session. So the first thing I want to start with is a little bit about me. I'm Joshua Unruh, and the reason you should care what I think about any superheroes is that I have spent almost my entire life reading superheroes. I literally learned to read on superheroes. The first thing that I can remember reading was an issue of Transformers. I think it was issue 4 when Marvel Comics was putting them out in 1984. They used to sell comic books at the grocery store, kids. And in addition to the spinner racks, they also would sell these packages of comics that I don't even know, didn't sell well, or they overprinted or whatever. And you would get these like 6 or 8 packs. Sometimes they were just 4 packs of comic books. And I remember getting one that had a couple of Spider-Man comics in it. And I want to say something that I never really got into at Marvel, but I don't recall what it was. And then 3 Transformers comics. And so the thing that I remember reading, first of all, is this issue of Transformers in 1984. I remember reading it to myself. And one reason I remember it sticking out is it ends with the Decepticons winning and Optimus Prime beheaded and all of the Autobots hung upside down, apparently dead or whatever. So that really stuck with me as a kid. But that's 1984. And as I am about to turn 40 this year, that means that I was 7 years old when I was reading superhero comics, and there has never been a point in my life that I wasn't reading superhero comics. That's just facts. They weren't necessarily always comics that I bought new with my own money or with birthday money or whatever. My library actually had a couple of collections well before that was a thing. But then as soon as I had a job, as soon as I had any spending money, I was spending it on comics. But that's not the only way that I took in superheroes. I have actually been alive long enough to see 3 different booms in superhero media. Now, the first one I was really young for. Super Friends was my first brush with the DC universe. It was very rudimentary animation. It was really simplistic storylines. You quickly got to wonder why anyone else ever showed up as long as Superman was there. But Super Friends was my first brush. Also, if you hang with me and hear me talk about superhero stuff for very long, it's also my first brush with Jack Kirby, who would become a huge influence on me when it comes to writing superhero type stories. I'm such a big fan of his that I have permanent Jack Kirby art on my body and plan to add more. So Super Friends was really my first brush with not just the DC universe, but also with Jack Kirby stuff, with Fourth World things, with Darkseid. Anyway, so there were Super Friends. And when I was a kid on the Marvel side, you had Spider-Man and his amazing friends. If you're not familiar with this, Spider-Man wound up with 2 X-Men as his roommates, living with Aunt May, Firestar and Iceman, and they hung out and went to college and were groovy kids and fought crime because Saturday morning cartoons were a thing then. So there was also a Hulk cartoon that I kind of remember. I remember like a Hulk Action Hour or something, but there was also a Lone Ranger cartoon. There was a Zorro cartoon. There was Flash Gordon and the Defenders of the Earth. That one wasn't on Saturday morning, but still there it was. There were even parody shows like Darkwing Duck, which was actually just a tremendous piece of comedy, animation, and action. Ms. Jensen is coming in on the chat, and she's asking if Space Ghost can be considered a type of intro into superhero stories. She remembers watching that, and of course, Sailor Moon. Okay, let's digress there, because that was a little later in my life when I came to Sailor Moon, but Sailor Moon is a big deal for me. But Space Ghost, absolutely. Those Hanna-Barbera cartoons like Space Ghost, before those became jokes, like Space Ghost Coast to Coast. I'm not going to digress too far into the joys of superheroes as a genre, But one of the coolest things about superheroes is how adaptable they are to all of these different kinds of stories. My favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe offering is Winter Soldier. And one of the reasons that it's my favorite is it's a 70s spy thriller that also has superheroes in it. Like, I like both of those things, and I like them even better together. Sailor Moon is 100% superhero fiction. But what I really like about opening up sort of my horizons for that is it's superhero fiction through both a Japanese lens and a distinctly feminine lens. They do not fight crime in the same way that Spider-Man fights crime or Batman fights crime, or even if you get a very specialized set of superheroes like the Power Rangers that only have one main big bad villain, even though that's a Japanese original, by the time it gets to America, it's no longer through that specific Japanese lens or through that very specific feminine lens where you can, with no irony, beat the bad guys with love and hope. That stuff's amazing. I came to that more in the 90s, just like everybody in America and Canada, which was also a second boom for superhero animation because Batman the Animated Series started in 1992, I think, 93, kind of riding the tails of the success of Batman the movie from 1989. You get Batman the Animated Series in the early 90s. You get Superman the Animated Series as a spin-off from that in the midder to later 90s. And those two shows become an entire DC animated universe that lasted for so long that I can remember my newlywed wife and I, the first year that we were married, rushing home to see the latest episode of Justice League when they were doing big season-long arcs. At the same time that Batman the Animated Series was coming on, you have Spider-Man the Animated Series and X-Men the Animated Series. And a whole bunch of people I know actually came to the X-Men via the animated series, which is kind of fascinating. We may talk about X-Men someday, especially in terms of that cartoon. But that was a second big boom that happened during my life. And then obviously now these days, thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this is the third big superhero boom that I have lived through. And honestly, it's the biggest one yet. And I can't imagine that I'm going to see a bigger one in my life. I thought Batman 89 was big, but really that was just Batman. It did not really stretch out. DC wasn't immediately trying to figure out how they were going to make a Superman movie. They weren't immediately trying to figure out how to make a universe, and Marvel basically ignored them because we only got made-for-TV movies and things from Marvel that were not fantastic. Some of them based on the Hulk live-action show that I saw in syndication. That's worth pointing out. These superhero things, they come, they go, they come, they go. But these booms are really a big deal because that's when I saw, having been kind of the elder statesman of this stuff, God help me, that's when I saw a whole bunch of new people come in. What's fascinating about this last boom to me is that comic books have become so impenetrable that it's difficult for me to go into the comic book store and find exactly the thing that I want. And so now to have all of these people going to the movies, huge opening weekends, getting very excited about these characters, and then just completely unsure of how to deal with them in other media. That's part of why I'm doing this. Because as much as I love watching the movies and as much as I love watching the TV shows that have come out of this latest boom, my heart belongs to comic books. And comic books have been the home of superheroes, the real bedrock upon which everything else, builds up from since 1939. So all of that, I have been in superheroes up to my eye since I was 7 years old. Now, in addition to that, I am a professional writer, a novelist. I write short stories, I write scripts, I write all of the things. I haven't written a lot of superhero stuff, though. That's because I think the jump for superheroes to prose is going to be tricky stuff. And so because of that, I have spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about how all this superhero stuff works. Like, how does the genre work? How do you adapt it? What works when you adapt it into the movie or into the TV show or into prose? What works? How do I get the stuff that I love about the genre into these other media, especially for me on the page? So in addition to thinking about superheroes way too much, I am also thinking way too hard about how they work as stories. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about Wonder Woman. She's who we're here for. I just wanted any of you who didn't know me well to have an idea of why you might care in the first place. Let's talk about Wonder Woman the movie. So for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, we're going to do some spoilers. There's going to be a little bit of spoily things going on right now. But I feel that we have to talk about the movie because for so many of you, that is the only version of Wonder Woman that you really have in mind. Again, I know that I am of a certain age, so I have a few other Wonder Women floating around in my head, both from comics, but also because I remember watching the Wonder Woman live action series with Linda Carter from the late 70s. And of course, I mentioned I have the DC Animated Universe version of Wonder Woman. So for really most of you, this new movie represents not just the Wonder Woman, but the Wonder Woman origin. And we're going to read an origin together. So since this is the only thing that a lot of you have to compare it to, I think we kind of have to talk about it because we're going to talk about those comparisons. And to me, who has lived through multiple universe reboots, looking at those different origins and how they work and what gets picked up and what gets dropped is really a big part of the excitement for me. So let's say up front, obviously, if I'm not being clear yet, let's say up front that I really enjoyed the Wonder Woman movie. It was not perfect, and it's worth having an in-depth conversation about the ways that it kind of falls short of a feminist ideal. However, even with those failings, it is incredibly important, and it's going to be a stepping stone for future female superhero movies. And in a lot of ways, it's going to be the bar that we measure them against. How am I supposed to evaluate Captain Marvel while I have Wonder Woman in the back of my mind, right? I will say that the first great decision that the movie made was setting it in World War I. That is a perfect entry point for Diana. You may know who Gail Simone is, and she has a great quote where she says, if you need to stop an asteroid, you call Superman. If you need to solve a mystery, you call Batman. But if you need to end a war, you call Wonder Woman. There is a lot to that. Superman saves lives, often on an epic scale, stopping earthquakes and asteroids and things like that. And if you have crime that needs dealt with or a mystery to solve, Batman's the world's greatest detective. He's the world's greatest crime fighter. That's the guy you call. But if you need everyone to just stop what they are doing for a minute and listen to a person who is both wise and powerful, I mean, that's Wonder Woman. That's what her job is. And for World War I to be the backdrop for that person is brilliant. And I'm going to betray some of my own feelings about history a little bit here, and you are free to argue with me about them. But one thing that I feel about our American history in terms of wars is that we have all told ourselves this very pleasant little fiction about how World War II was the last good war. It's the one we can feel good about being in. Whatever else is going on, we were the good guys in World War II. World War II was the one where everybody knew what they were doing, why they were doing it. And I think we see that actually in the Captain America, the First Avenger. Captain America had very much that feel of we kicked ass and looked good doing it. And that's very appropriate for Captain America and to a certain extent for World War II. But it's wildly inappropriate for Wonder Woman. War is the only true enemy, right? And Wonder Woman will show us that that's true. And World War I was, by all accounts, the stupidest and most destructive conflict that this world has ever seen. You have countless deaths ordered by men who didn't even want to be in the war. Like, everybody just made these alliances. Somebody set off the tinder, and then everybody was like, well, I guess we're fighting everybody then. I'm simplifying, obviously, but that is the real history of World War I. And so even those who might still try and make a claim that war in and of itself is noble and glorious, they don't make that claim about World War I. Just like all wars, the Great War is a tragedy. But unlike other wars, we don't pretend like it isn't. And what's more, I mean, this is true for a lot of wars, but I think especially true for the purposes of the way we're talking about World War I. But men started it. Men perpetuated it. Men escalated it. When the men who were fighting the war stopped one Christmas, they just stopped the war because it was too cold and instead played soccer. It was the politicians at home and their officers who came out there and started the war back up. Men did this thing. And into that space, we see a woman step in from outside. She's outside man's world. She steps in and she says, no more. And that is really, really cool. Also, from a historical perspective, this is also prime time for what we call feminism's first wave. Feminism's first wave came in from Edwardian England. You had in America during the Wild West period, you had women being considered extremely valuable, both for what they brought to the table as far as culture, but also what they brought to the table as far as the work that they did on these homesteads. And then you have like a mass urbanization all over again, and you just have a large group of women demanding the rights on paper that they should have. That leads to a suffragette movement and that kind of thing. And this is all what we call historically feminism's first wave. And I got to tell you, as much as Wonder Woman makes sense also showing up in World War II, which is what she did in the comics, it makes so much more story sense to me that she should show up right in the middle of that. And to a great extent, that's emphasized in the movie by Etta. Etta Candy is very much that, well, we're fighting for the vote and we do it with our principles, which I love Etta Candy. We'll talk more about Etta as we go. But that first wave of feminism just feels like a really powerful moment for Wonder Woman and the Amazon ethos, the sisterhood, to step in and be a big player. Going on with other things the movie does well. It doesn't start with man's world. Even if you don't know anything about Wonder Woman, if you go into that theater, you probably went knowing, from trailers if nothing else, that some mope was going to crash land on Themyscira and become the reason that Diana goes to man's world. But take note that we didn't start with that mope. We didn't start with Steve Trevor. We start this movie with Diana. And that just makes sense because it's her story. And you'd think that's obvious, but we're going to talk about this other story here in a little while where they go a little different way. Additionally, not only do we start with the Amazons, but the Amazons have a clear duty in the world. They have a clear goal that they are all supposed to be working towards, and it informs Diana's life choices. Now, they ignore it. They don't do a great job of actualizing that goal, but Diana does on their behalf. Like, in a way, she's the one true Amazon, right? That she goes out into the world like they all should have and fights Ares directly. But she does that because she has been raised from the cradle knowing what the Amazon's duty is. And that just gives us a clear storytelling reason for people to do stuff, right? Talking about Amazons, because I cannot get enough of talking about Amazons. Not only do they have a clear duty, but our two biggest, best examples of them are Hippolyta and Antiope. And I just could not believe that they allowed both those characters to be middle-aged women that are nevertheless extremely beautiful and extremely powerful. I know that ostensibly Amazons are immortal. They let these women become middle-aged. They allowed both Hippolyta and Antiope to play the role of wise old sages, even though they were women. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but that's really out of the ordinary. And if you think it's not, try and imagine, same time that Linda Carter's on screen as Wonder Woman, try and imagine recasting Obi-Wan Kenobi as a woman in her 60s. Try and imagine that happening in the late 70s. Try and imagine it happening almost any time. This is wildly outside of the ordinary, and I love it, and it fits with the movie. It is as it should be. Ms. Jensen, it's an American idea that women are only beautiful when they're young. It really is. I mean, I agree with you that is problematic on a variety of levels, which is why I avoided a lot. I think I saw one trailer, so I avoided a lot of trailers. I went in very much a wide-eyed innocent, as unknowing about the Wonder Woman movie as I could be. I just kept getting overwhelmed at how out of the ordinary it was that we got to have Hippolyta and Antiope be older women who never stop being beautiful and also able to kick your ass, right? I am under no illusions that I have a shot at winning even a thumb wrestling competition with Antiope. So leaving Themyscira a little bit, other things that the movie does incredibly well. I mentioned my love for Etta Candy. She is great. If there had been 25, 35, 100% more Etta Candy. If it had been Diana and Etta Candy beat up bad guys movie, I would have been super cool with this. My only regret, as far as she's concerned, is that she never knocked a dude out. She jokes about getting into fisticuffs, and then she never actually is allowed to get into fisticuffs. And since I am a fan of Etta Candy from the comic books, especially her earliest incarnations, I was really looking forward to the moment that, she'd step in and just clock a dude in the headpiece and put him on the ground. And lastly, Ares as her first defining villain is brilliant. It's the way it should be. War, capital W, is the only enemy that man, capital M, really has. That's the thing that just stops us from being everything that we could be. It's the thing that makes us hate other people because they're from the other side of this imaginary line, and we hate them so much that we go kill them. And if you think about it in terms like that, it's just ridiculous that that's even a thing. And for Wonder Woman to show up and say to the human being males, no, be better, and then turn to the male gods as well and say, no, be better. That's amazing. So I mentioned that we were going to talk in brief, at least, about some of the ways that the movie falls short. And again, some of the stuff is feminist stuff, and some of the stuff is story stuff, and some of it is honestly both. Briefly, because again, there are lots of people who are doing more detailed and more scholarly and just deeper work. Women and people of color who are dealing with this stuff in a much more upfront way than I am as a straight white man are doing better work than me. So we're just going to breeze past a lot of this. Women of color are not well portrayed on Themyscira. We get a schoolmarm as our introduction to women of color on the island. And then later we get one who is apparently the hyper-masculine Amazon, which they're all able to do these amazing feats of arms. But I say this sarcastically. Of course, it's the one from African descent who is growling and is the strongest, the one who gets hit with a stick and has no reaction whatsoever. I just mentioned I'm the straight white guy, so, all this with a grain of salt. But I felt like the movie just nodded at queer sexuality rather than embracing it on screen. And that seems like a mistake. That seems like a lost opportunity for a Wonder Woman movie, in my opinion. I don't love the entire romantic subplot with Steve, at all. Although, do push back on me if you feel like that worked better than I did. But I really kind of felt like it was a clunky side road that we did not really even need to go down. And I don't know that I entirely buy it. Clearly, he is an attractive man. And apparently, Diana is bisexual. She's attracted to him. I don't know if that's as easy and obvious as it should be. By all means, push back on me if you think that worked better than I do. But I could have lived without it. The only other prominent woman cast member, once we leave the island, I mentioned how amazing Hippolyta and Antiope are. But once we leave the island, we get Etta, also awesome, but then we go to war. And the only woman who's there, so that's most of the second and all of the third act, the only woman who's there, other than Diana, is a villain with some body horror going on. Which again, we're talking about that American and European feeling that women are only beautiful when they're young, and then that and this is not part of the movie, but I mean, I think we can all agree that this is part of our culture, that any blemish decreases that beauty. And then you have this woman who is scarred and has to hide it with this weird porcelain doll thing. It just doesn't look great. And at the end of it all, Diana doesn't make a special entreaty to her as a sister. And I'm going to grant you that is possibly a very Josh-specific mistake, because I can remember in the first or second episode, the pilot episode of Linda Carter's Wonder Woman, that she makes this incredibly earnest call to a woman who is working with the Nazis to put that aside, to put aside the Nazi agenda that clearly does not value women, to even put aside America if necessary, and just look at what she was doing to her sisters. It worked. And kind of like Christopher Reeve as Superman, on anybody else, that kind of earnestness and sincerity would just be ridiculous. But in that moment on that show, she sells it. And I really wanted to see that from Diana to Dr. Poison in the movie. And I didn't get it. And I miss it. I wish it were there. Partly because the only other prominent woman through most of the movie is Dr. Poison. I think that feeds also into the fact that there's just not enough sisterhood shown in Amazon life. Most of our time on Themyscira is spent fighting. I think that the story of the movie would have been a lot stronger if we had seen more of the Amazonian sisterhood. Give us a little something more of what it is that Diana represents and is fighting for out in man's world. Susie Jensen has a hard time with romances in all movies with believing that they happen in so short a time. Yeah, I mean, the short, protracted time frame is kind of often a problem with romances, but I felt like especially here, when you're dealing with somebody who's got a lot of cultural baggage, that's super different than our cultural baggage. And then Ethan says that Dr. Poison feels like a comic book holdover no one really thought about. Well, I mean, yes and no. they did make some efforts. The Dr. Poison in the comics is real Yellow Peril stuff. For those of you that may not know, Yellow Peril is a kind of shorthand for when the Far East was demonized and othered. And you get like Fu Manchu novels come from this time. Honestly, when you look at Batman things, Ra's al Ghul is kind of Yellow Peril. He's Yellow Peril-esque at the very least. So Dr. Poison was, I think, Chinese man in the comics. So some pretty specific thinking went into that adaptation. And to be honest, I don't think it's great. I mean, they clearly thought about it, but I don't think that they actually did the right kind of thinking. But to be honest, minus some body horror and plus Diana making a heartfelt plea to her on behalf of sisterhood, I think it would have worked a lot better. Again, I have an axe to grind there, but that's a thing I'll go to the mattresses over. So returning to the things that they don't do so well. That script dropped the ball pretty hard on the racial or ethnic costs of war. There was even a moment when Chief brings up the fact that it's Steve Trevor's people who left his people with absolutely nothing after a war. And I don't even know that we even get a reaction shot from Diana, let alone her stepping up and saying, God, something. I don't know. I don't know what I wanted her to say there, but I wanted her to do something other than nothing, right? And if you don't want to deal with it, script, don't bring it up. This again goes back to Diana being outside of our systems and how even if we don't see a lot of good representation of women of color on Themyscira, they are there. We never get any inkling that they are lesser citizens. Amazons are Amazons, right? And it just feels like she would have had something to say there. Okay, controversial statement. I do not love the question of Diana's parentage. I think that Zeus being her father is a really bad idea, and we can talk about that more as we go forward. That was fairly recently introduced, but I don't love Zeus as her father. I don't love her as a demigod. And I appreciate that the movie at least left it a little ambiguous so that I can pretend that was a red herring. Susie, I'm not sure I understand your question. It makes her outside of her community or overpowered. Are you asking about Zeus? Are you talking about Zeus as her father takes her outside of her community and overpowers her? Diana is not a true Amazon. I hadn't thought about it from that specific point because even in the comic book origins that I like, where she doesn't actually have a father, she is still different than the other Amazons who weren't born on the island. So she's different than them. So I think the differentness doesn't bother me. I do feel like the demigodness moves her outside of her community more than having a father being born on the island. It does make her other, right? In this place where otherness is not supposed to be a thing. I don't actually think godlike powers are a problem because I've been reading superhero comics my whole life. Superpowers are not actually supposed to make sense. I don't believe that you can overpower somebody. You just can't. A thing that I like to say as a writer is that every superhero has the same set of powers. They're called protagonist powers. They are as powerful as they need to deal with the plot that's put in front of them. So it's less about the overpowering for me and more about the idea that I like a society of women whose best and brightest example is a woman who was born from a woman with no help from a man. There is a all-female Madonna and child thing going on there. And while I don't usually appreciate the Christological imagery that just gets smashed onto superheroes, especially Superman, that's pretty powerful in terms of Wonder Woman, that Madonna with daughter, surrounded by female aunts and cousins and things like that. That's really my problem with Zeus stepping in, is that making her a demigod just kind of takes her out of that. There's a better message there that comes without Zeus being involved, in my opinion. Okay, so Ethan asks, does it have to be Zeus? Seriously. One issue that we have with Zeus is that in Greek mythology, Zeus is kind of terrible, right? I mean, he is a philanderer and a serial rapist. He's kind of the worst. And he gets Judeo-Christianed up a little bit here for our purposes in this movie. And I do feel like that's a problem. I do feel like that's not entirely honest with the mythological roots. But if we are completely fair, Zeus was becoming more like the Judeo-Christian god even before Christianity really overtook Western civilization. Already in Homer, you get suggestions that he is a just lawgiver and is the only one who is not beholden to fate. He can change fate if he wants to. It really doesn't get much earlier than Homer. At the same time, we have traditions from that time where he's awful. So that transformation of him from that extremely humanistic version of a god becoming a much more just and trustworthy boss of all gods and humans, that's been going on for a while. I don't love it, honestly, but it's not as terrible as it could be. Boy, that became a mythology lesson. That was unexpected. Sorry about that. I guess it's a Wonder Woman comic. It's going to happen again. So lastly, and again, I will say this is maybe a little bit Josh focused as far as a complaint, but the Amazons seem like they're the same as they've always been for 3,000 years as far as advancement is concerned. And I prefer them to be at least as technologically advanced as man's world. Their society doesn't need to change, right? Like in theory, it's perfect. We have a queen, but really we're all sisters and we make choices together. Again, we don't really see how that works, but technologically, they're the same place that they've been for 3,000 years. And you can blame other origins for putting this idea into my head, but I prefer if the Amazons are at least as technologically advanced as man's world, but differently. And I say differently because they weren't always busy making phallic-shaped weapons to stab one another with, or missiles to fire, or machine guns, or whatever it was. All the stuff that we've spent the last however long of human history making our biggest advances in technology because of war, they didn't. But they should still be able to make big advances. That's what I think. So I would have liked to have seen that. Now I'm done talking about the movie. So I said it wasn't going to be much, and I may have been a liar. I heard from a lot of you patrons that you weren't that interested in hearing about the publishing history, and I get it. I totally get it in terms of Wonder Woman. I'm actually approaching this very differently than I expected to because of that request. However, I do think we need to talk a little bit about Rebirth. Those of you who bought the book, you noticed that it had been branded as Rebirth. And I think we need to talk a little bit about that because it gives some structure and framework to the origin story. So talking about Rebirth, in 2016, DC Comics decided to clean up a mess it had made with a new publishing initiative. The mess that it made was its previous new publishing initiative that they called the New 52. I don't think that it's a stretch to call that a failed publishing initiative at this point. One of the reasons that it was kind of a failure is it soft rebooted the DC universe. It made everybody a lot younger and changed some things, but not other things. And it wasn't entirely clear which things had been changed. And honestly, you're going to hear us say this about Rebirth also, but it really tried to grid up and make cool the DC universe. And that fails to recognize the fact that the DC universe is cool in its own way already. So the way that they decided to address this line wide, like this is across every book that they publish, was to do another soft reboot, but this time hopefully learning from their mistakes. And this retelling of Diana's origin is part of that Rebirth relaunch. Let me say, we will eventually take a look at the New 52 Diana, which I don't think gets a full-bore origin story like this, but you do find out how her origins are different during the relaunch. But it's going to be a while before we look at them. It's got some serious problems, and I want you guys to be prepared for it. One of those serious problems is that's where the Zeus as parent comes in. That's not by any stretch the most egregious part of it, in my opinion. We will get there, but it's not the greatest origin. So I started with Rebirth Year One because so many of you came out of the movie interested in Wonder Woman. Being a superhero comic book guy, want you to be able to read comic books afterwards. And so I started with the one with the origin that leads into the comics now. So in theory, if you liked this well enough, you could continue reading on a monthly basis. So we will eventually get back to there, but it's not spectacular, and it was actually going to be confusing if you wanted to try and go forward from there. So just kind of ignore the New 52 for now. Just know that Rebirth is the response to the New 52 and why we were getting a new origin. And that I feel like that's really important context. I don't know why they made the origin story volume 2. I'm very confused by that choice. But I can say that on the monthly schedule, they were coming out twice a month, Wonder Woman comics were. And you were getting a present day story in the odd numbered issues. And you were getting the retelling of the origin in the even numbered issues. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 are the origin. And 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 are the present day story called The Lies. I think part of why they did this was to hook readers in with both things. There is a certain school of old comic book reader thought that you're like, why do I care about this origin? I already know who this person is. Let's do the thing. But DC was also trying to make it comfortable for new readers to come in. And so they kind of split the difference by putting out 2 stories more or less simultaneously, if that makes sense. So now why they decided to, when they collected those into volumes, why they decided to make the origin volume 2, I do not know. I cannot for the life of me think of why they would do that. It's very confusing. You're dealing with a very different customer buying trades. Trade paperbacks is what those collections are typically called. And you're dealing with a very different customer who would pull that off the shelf at Barnes & Noble or go to Amazon and pick it up than you are with your weekly or monthly comic book buyer. I don't know. I can't explain it. It seems like a bad idea. So I feel like the Rebirth relaunch is important context because it explains why we're getting another new origin in so short a time, but it also explains, or should at least inform, some of the decisions that get made in that story of what to emphasize or who to emphasize and when in the story and why. It should, in my opinion, inform those things. We'll see as we go and chat with one another if we think that's the case. I like new origins. I like when older origins have to get retold. That is kind of cool and exciting to me. Honestly, more on the writer side of my brain than the superhero fan side of my brain. That lets me recognize that they are a bit of a challenge. You have to sit down at these things and ask yourself, what is so culturally significant about this character's origin that you would literally be wasting your time if you talk about it? Or what's so culturally significant but of another time that you need to recontextualize it, right? And so I have some examples of this. Superman's had a couple of different origins. Krypton seems to change a little bit with each one. There was a time when DC Comics' stated purpose was to have kids know more about the geography and political science of Krypton than they did about their actual civics assignment in school. And so they fleshed Krypton out, and it was big and it was important and it was full of all kinds of like grand history and personalities and things like that. One reboot of Superman later, and it turns into Vulcan, but worse. We don't actually touch one another. Computers decide who we're going to have children with. They are put in little indestructible pods to grow up. We are never, ever, ever going to actually have a pregnant Kryptonian. My God, what kind of heathens do you think we are? You go from this like robust, huge Krypton to this very cold, sterile Krypton. And oddly enough, that doesn't really change much about Superman, but it does kind of say, hey, by the way, we're not going to talk about Krypton as much. Like, we're going to focus on Superman on Krypton. That was the point of that shift, right? When it comes to things that are so culturally significant that you need to recontextualize them, Batman has a good example of this. In his earliest stories, Batman toted guns. Going forward not very far, you get a retelling of his origin where his parents are gunned down, and suddenly that guy carrying guns doesn't make as much sense. So we got to recontextualize that, right? Take those kinds of ideas and apply them to Rebirth Year 1 here and ask, what are the themes of the story that the author, I mean, I know death of the author, right? So let's talk. What are the themes of the story that you feel like are supposed to be there? And how do you, as a writer, I would say, how can you keep the origin same enough that you don't alienate everyone in the world while also emphasizing the things that you want to make thematically important for this run? You'll notice I used a Superman and a Batman example to show what I meant by recontextualizing or ignoring. That's because I feel like this job of doing Wonder Woman's origin is particularly tricky because she has been hugely culturally significant. But at the same time, she's kind of a muddle compared to more pristine superhero concepts like Batman and Superman. There's all kinds of reasons for that we'll talk about as we talk about other origins, but you know, there it is. Talking a little bit about the creators. This story was written by Greg Rucka. I am a Greg Rucka fan. Let's go on record as that. He is well known for strong female protagonists. I only use his name and the words strong female protagonist together in an ironic way about 25% of the time. Most of the time he does a really good job with the strong female protagonist. For instance, he has an amazing spy character in a book called Queen and Country. Actually, I'm not going to list a whole bunch of them off. He has a lot of really excellent female characters, but every now and then he slips into a place where I'm just like, oh my God, Greg, for real? Like, this is what we're going to do? These are the tropes that we're going to trot out? So he is responsible for a previous and much beloved Wonder Woman run that emphasized her role as ambassador from Themyscira and peacekeeper. And you're going to get a lot of that in this origin. You're also going to get some things where you wonder, is this really the best that you could do on this iconic female character? In my opinion. Again, we're going to talk about it, but there's some choices here that are less than stellar. The story is drawn by Nicola Scott. Her mainstream breakthrough into superhero comics was actually in 2015 on a book called Earth 2. But she's also worked on Star Wars books and several titles with what I would call strong feminist ties. Some examples of that are Birds of Prey and Secret Six, both of which she worked on with Gail Simone, who is responsible for our quote that we started all this with. Nicola Scott has also drawn some Buffy tie-in comics. I have not read them. I haven't read most of the Buffy comics. If you talk to me about Buffy, you will know that I also feel like the feminist bona fides of Buffy vary wildly depending on a whole host of factors. So I haven't read those, so I don't know where she's at on those. And then lastly, and probably the thing that got her this job, if I'm guessing, well, there are two things. She's working on a create-her-own thing with Greg Rucka, but she also drew a Wonder Woman tie-in to the Green Lantern epic Blackest Night. All those things probably came together to have her as the pick for this thing. So that's Rebirth and the creators that went into this. So I'm jokingly referring to this section as, here's a story about Steve and Diane. A little bit of a musical joke for you. And I'm going to refer to this as covering chapters 1 and 2 of the story. We all know that these were the first 2 issues of the comic book, or the first 2 even issues of the comic book that were coming out. But once we get them all collected together, I think it makes more sense to approach it a little bit like a novel or a short story and say these are the first 2 chapters. So looking at the first 2 chapters of this story as a unit, I feel like what we mostly get are Steve and Diana as individuals and kind of contrasted. So we get them as individuals on their own, and then they meet, and then they leave Themyscira. In the process of that, we are going to look at some backstories. Obviously Diana, obviously Steve, and also Hippolyta. Kind of an interesting choice. Let me talk about some of the story choices that they make for their backstories. Clearly, we are not dealing with World War I, right? This is modern day, or as close to modern day as we can get, knowing that this is still in the past of the main continuity. It's basically now, right? This means that Steve is not an American on loan to English forces. He is, in fact, I guess, a Navy SEAL. We know he is by the time he's on Themyscira, but I'm never clear on exactly what his training is like, or what exactly he's training for, or how long it takes, like how much time it passes. I'm not really sure how much time passes for Diana either, but that is less of a problem on Themyscira because they're immortal and it can be a really long time and not be weird. Steve is just a little more of a question mark. So like I say, clearly we're not in World War I, which makes a huge change to Steve's backstory. I think it also changes Diana's quite a bit. We don't have nearly the same specificity of duty and purpose for the Amazons, which means Diana also lacks that specificity of purpose and duty. And that's kind of a problem. It's a problem in comparison to the movie. I really appreciated how specific her focus was and that it came directly from the Amazons. So we're lacking that a little bit. We also get some backstory for Hippolyta, but not quite the same as the movie, as the other big origin we have. And she is equally reticent to allow Diana to leave, but it seems like for very different reasons. She doesn't want Diana to leave because she is protective of her daughter. But once Diana chooses to leave in the comic, Hippolyta is clearly very proud of her and realizes that it's the thing that she has to do. In the movie, it's a little more ambiguous, I feel, right? Hippolyta understands that Diana must do what she is going to do, that she feels compelled by the duty. But we don't really deal with why Hippolyta doesn't feel like that's more of the duty. So in discussing some of these story choices, I know that I have story wonk refugees and chipperish folks in this seminar. So discussing what these things change, right? And maybe why. If you read the odd issues of the comics, Greg Rucka clearly wanted to keep a relationship with Steve Trevor forefront in his story for Diana. And we can't do that if it's 100 years later from when they meet. Looking over here, Susie says it felt weird that Steve's timeline was moving forward so much and that it also wasn't clear. I agree. So on the upfront, overall, I really enjoy this origin, like kind of broadly, but the more that I started getting into the weeds on it, the less I thought it was executed extremely well. And I think we see some of that stuff even here in the beginning with being unsure of the timeline of both characters, but especially Steve. You know, like, again, we can be a little ambiguous with Diana. She has thousands of years if necessary. But Steve, it's like, is this the course of 5 years, 10 years, a year? It's really unclear. So with these changes, Diana is a little more, I feel in this comic book, a little more wide-eyed and a little more naive even than the movie version of her, because she lacks that specific focus and drive and duty and is still, nevertheless, so compelled to get Steve back to man's world. She's doing it more for Steve, I guess, or the concept of compassion than she is for duty, which could be a really interesting choice for the Amazons. We'll see how it plays out. With Steve, making him a modern day soldier, if you have Steve in World War I, who is an American, involving himself in the Great War, he volunteered, obviously. America's not in the war in the capacity that it would take for him to be as important as he is in the story. He volunteered. He had to go over there and say, I want to be part of this fight, and here's how. I mean, he may have had some backing. I think he talks about having some backing of the American government. He's been trained in some other stuff. But he also says he tried doing nothing when it came to dealing with the war, and that this is his answer to doing nothing, is to do this thing. There is an element of altruism and heroism that comes out in that is maybe less obvious or less overt. I don't want to question the commitment of anyone who joins the American military in the modern day, but it's a less overt and obvious style of altruism where you have Steve Trevor of the movie choosing to get involved in a war that has nothing to do with him other than the fact that he knows people are suffering. So talking about the art, I think that Nicola Scott's art is beautiful, and it sounds like many of you agree, or at least a couple of you agree. But I think it's really, really beautiful. But I wonder how it integrates with the story, with the dialogue, or in some ways fails to integrate with the dialogue. I have had people who told me that they couldn't read comics. I figured out later, part of that was because they would read all the dialogue really, really fast. I think Kate actually had this problem. She mentioned having this problem. You would read all the dialogue super, super fast and not pay as much attention to the art, and that it didn't make sense, right? And that's a thing that can happen. When art and dialogue in comics are well integrated, the story just gets that much better. When they are a little disjointed, if you only look at one or the other, the story doesn't work. I should be able to tell what's going on, honestly, without the dialogue when it comes to action. That's just good visual storytelling. But when character-driven and a lot of learning about who these people are, the art and the dialogue really needs to mesh. And I'm not sure, despite it being beautiful, I'm not sure that it always does. All right, let's swing into this beat by beat breakdown. I'll go through it as quickly as I can, but we're winging through 2 issues. And I'm going to editorialize a little bit as we go, but I will do the majority of my own editorial at the end. We start with Steve and his friend who are lost but looking to the stars to find their way. I'm going to point out right there, we start this story with Steve, and I think that is a really bad idea. I think that that's a problem. I know they wanted to show us some beauty of Themyscira on a 2-page spread of the next page, but nevertheless, that leaves us starting Wonder Woman story with this man. And I don't know why that would be the choice we would make. Nevertheless, you have Steve looking to the stars to find his way. And when you turn, you have Diana, who is supposed to be looking to the stars, but instead she is looking to the horizon, which is kind of cool, right? Steve wants to get to his objective, but instead he has to look to the sky. Diana's objective is looking at the stars, but instead she's looking at the horizon. In the process of this, her talking about wanting to leave the island, Diana talking about wanting to leave the island, we learn a little bit of Amazon backstory. We learn in a throwaway line that the women who are on Themyscira, presumably except for Diana, are women who were killed by men. Specifically, in the case of her friend Kasia, they were women who were killed by men when they said no to those men's advances. I think it's also suggested that Kasia and Diana might be a little more than friends. We established that Diana is princess of the island and that her mother Hippolyta is queen. And there seems to be a genuinely loving relationship between them with perhaps some strain. I'm a little confused about that myself. But it seems like there's this weird tension that gets injected into their relationship, and I'm not sure why it's there. And there's nothing going on in the backstory. We don't get enough of the backstory to know why they might be lightly butting heads. And it also might just be that I'm kind of confused by that lack of meshing between the art and the dialogue. Tell me what you all think. Then we leave Themyscira. We go back to Steve and his buddy on the firing range. And the best that I can guess is that this is supposed to show us that they are super tight bros. We go from there back to Diana, who is also at the shooting range with Hippolyta and Philippus. Again, I'm a little confused here. She appears to be distracted, but also incredibly skilled because she misses the shot at first and Philippus is critiquing her technique. But then she turns around and does this thing that ought to be impossible right in the middle of Philippus chewing her out about it. Is Diana kind of a off in the clouds dreamer, thinking about all of the places that she hasn't visited yet because she's an Amazon of Themyscira? Is that what we're supposed to get? I'm just not sure. I'm guessing. Then we have some juxtaposition of Diana and Steve as they, I'm not really sure, grow up. In Diana's case, I think a little bit, train in Steve's case, or maybe it's all training. This is done in a big 2-page spread. It has a lot of panels juxtaposed to one another. We're going to come back to this at the end because I want to really look at these panels because there's just a lot going on in here. And I'm not sure that I understand exactly what they were trying to get across. And I really want to hear you guys' thoughts. And there's also some super problematic stuff mixed in there. Then we have a scene where Diana finds a clearly evil tree and is bitten by a viper. And then Amazons find her and she's dying and they rush her to the surgeon. Then we cut to Steve becoming a godfather, which I guess is a juxtaposition between her going to the hospital and him also coming to the hospital, but the reasons are very different. Then we have a scene where we learn a little bit about Amazon religion and how Diana's sickness might be a sign. We get a little more backstory here. Amazons are described as the daughters of Harmonia and Ares. I think that's a really interesting choice. One thing that will come up often as you look at these different Wonder Woman origins is who are the patrons of the Amazons and how do those patrons change the things that the Amazons think and believe about the world. And so Daughters of Harmonia and Ares is definitely a callback to the earliest Greek myths. Ares is the Olympian of war. We know about that guy. Harmonia is also known as Concordia in Roman tradition. She is the Olympian of harmony or concord. She's also sometimes the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, and sometimes she is the love of Ares, who bore the girls that, quote, fell in love with fighting and become the Amazons. Greek mythology is not always super consistent, but I think it's really interesting that they went with Daughters of Harmonia and Ares because this may contradict some of the earlier world building. I don't see the obvious way that we can join this idea that they are women who were murdered by men brought to this island after they were murdered, I guess, and that they were the Amazons of myth. Maybe that'll come out later. Maybe I'm missing something that would make that syncretism very easy and obvious, but I don't know. It doesn't quite mesh in my head. Susie is expecting a line, something like Hippolyta had in the movie where today you are my greatest sorrow. There's something kind of like that. I really liked that bit in the movie, but I might like some of the way they do it in this comic book better. We'll talk more about it when we get there. In addition to the religion lesson of the Amazons, this is our first look at the new version of the Lasso of Truth, aka the Perfect, aka the Patron's Gift, and their promise to the Amazons. That's pretty cool. I know that there was some talk in the chat wondering if this is the first time that the Lasso of Truth had ever been described as the Perfect, and I think so. But I think it's a pretty cool permutation of the concept of the Lasso of Truth. I didn't think it needed any work, but this is a pretty slick update. I like it. We then have a moment of Steve and his buddy gearing up for a mission. And I'm a little, again, I keep saying this. I want you to know, overall, I did enjoy this story, but I was confused a lot when I really started digging in. I'm a little confused about what this moment is supposed to do for us. Is it this buddy's first mission since they've been married? Since he was married? We saw the scene where Steve's buddy, who I'm not sure if we ever get a name for. If we did, I missed it. Is this their first mission since Steve's friend was married? Or is it the first one since he was a father? Or is it the first one since both of those things? This is the place where the timeline is kind of confusing to me. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel about this wedding ring coming off and going in the pocket. Surely they have been on missions since the guy got married. So it seems like it must be their first mission after he's had his child, but it's the wedding ring that they use as the symbol of that. And I don't know. It's a little weird. Kate is saving me, telling me that Steve's friend is Nick. I got to tell you, though, I read this thing a lot and it never stuck with me. I don't know what that means for Nick. Maybe I was just focused on the wrong stuff. So then we have the Amazons stargazing again. Diana still looks to the horizon, and this is the reason that she sees the plane crashing. I thought that Philippus's line, "We are discovered," was really cool. Like, I could just imagine the delivery of that line being full of gravitas. And the fact that we transition right from that to discovering the dead men, and right from that to discovering a living Steve. As many of these juxtapositions don't quite mesh the way that I wish they would, that's a really good laying out of those story elements together. That discovering the plane crash and the discovering of the dead men and Steve actually ends the first issue, and we go into the second chapter where we start with a meeting of the Council of Themyscira. There's a few things that I notice here. First of all, that there is a council. Hippolyta is clearly the queen, but she takes counsel, and her counselors are good at what they do. Like, the Amazons are on point here. We also find out that all the men died except for Steve, who's being treated. He's in rough shape, but he should pull through. This is maybe a hint that the Amazon technology is as good or better as medical technology in man's world, or it might just be magic. I'm not super clear. They are kind of coy about using the term man's world, which I thought was a weird choice. I don't know why that they would call it anything else. They spend a lot of time doing a deep look at the symbolism on the patches, and then they are absolutely flabbergasted by guns, which I thought was amazing. If you could imagine the most overt symbol of war in the world, the most overt symbol of violence, it's a gun. It's any gun. That is the most overt symbol that you could think of for the modern world for just doing violence. And sometimes we revere it, just like the Romans used to revere their sword, or the samurai revered their sword, and sometimes we're terrified of it, right? But to have a society that A, is very peaceful and doesn't work on weapons, and B, the long-range weapon they still have is the nearly silent arrow, to have them so absolutely shocked by the noise and power of the gun is good storytelling. It sort of re-shocked me all over again, even though I already know what guns are, right? To have Philippus immediately jump to the conclusion that it is an invasion, I think is pretty reasonable, especially for us, the reader, because we have no idea what those guys' mission was, right? For all we know, they were gearing up to go to Themyscira. For all we know, they weren't. Like, it's just not clear. Yeah, and Susie says she thought the same in order to understand the gun pretty well. That is what I mean by the Amazons being on point. They read a lot of very specific and articulate and correct information from this gear, right? And they figure out, this is another nod to maybe they're more technologically advanced than they look, because they get what all this stuff is right away. Right away, they understand it. Yeah, Robbie brings up borrowing a Lonnie Diane Rich line about guns being unearned power. Yes, that sounds familiar. I think she's talked about that in terms of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of this scene, because Philippus specifically mentions how terrifying it is. And Castalia, the religious advisor, tries to say, oh, is that really so much different than arrows? And in the moment, it feels like we're led to believe that Castalia wins that point, but it doesn't really work for me. I mean, it doesn't feel like Castalia wins that point. The idea that guns are unearned power, whereas the Amazons have had to train and been gifted by the gods or whatever, is really interesting. So speaking of that argument between Philippus, who believes it's an invasion, and Castalia, who feels that it's the will of the Olympians, is really interesting. Philippus notes Poseidon's trident on the patch, and that Poseidon is not necessarily a friend of the Amazons, and that is a good point. There's also some stuff in here where Hippolyta reads a lot of American exceptionalism into the eagle that I personally could do without. Its head is bowed, like it is prepared to go to war, but does not wish to go to war. What? That does not sound like something that should come out of an Amazon's mouth. In terms of the DC universe, where Amazons are peaceful and worried about learning and scholarship and bettering themselves, That sounds more like something you'd hear from the mythological Amazons, and then they would think that whoever uses an eagle that is ready for war but doesn't want to go to war is weak. So it feels like a weird in-between space that I don't entirely understand where she was coming from, other than we're getting a heavy dose of American exceptionalism. Hippolyta is the final word, however. She sees it that the gods are speaking, but she's unsure how they should answer. Also in the scene, we get the first clear, like abundantly clear suggestion that Hippolyta and Philippus are a couple. At least I think it is. I think this is where she describes her as my love. And we've had them often together, Hippolyta and Philippus, but this is the first overt example that we've had. Before now, the biggest example we had is, we had two. One that makes me think that maybe Diana and Cassia are something more than friends. And the other one is the 2-page spread that's a little problematic that we're going to talk about later. We move from the council to Steve waking up. Diana is there. They don't share a language, but they obviously share a connection. They try to get something across to one another. Steve cries on Diana's shoulder about his dead comrades and possibly more specifically about Nick. Do we kind of buy this breakdown of Steve's in this moment? I do think that it's meant to soften Steve for us. We are supposed to see that he is a man in touch with his feelings, I think, that he is a man who will impress Diana and hopefully other Amazons with his compassion. But I don't know. It also felt a little strained to me. It felt a little out of character from the stoic, stand apart, hard as, they never really show him as hard as nails, but they definitely show him as the stoic stand apart from the other men in his squad, thinking philosophical thoughts about war instead of being excited to go to war. I don't know. They're trying to paint him as not the typical soldier in those things, but I don't know if that was enough for me to be convinced that he would cry on the shoulder of Diana in this moment. We go back to the council where Castalia drops the bomb that Diana has received her wound at the gate. Everybody freaks out. But I'm not sure why, because this is the first time that we've heard about the gate. But everyone freaks out, and we realize that Hippolyta hid some of the truth of Diana's wound, and I'm curious about that. But it does sell the idea that everyone would freak out. But it does leave me wondering, what is the gate? What does that have to do with Ares walking free? This is the first we've heard of the Amazon duty and that they failed. What does any of that mean, right? That's the question. Kate says, I would expect any sole survivor of a military unit to feel both sad and guilty. I don't disagree. Like, I don't want you to hear more than I'm saying that I wish that Steve had been more of like the, tough guy Rambo. I'm just going to grit my teeth and go through this. I like that he is apparently a man more in touch with his feelings. It's kind of a breakdown moment in this room with a person he doesn't know. I mean, maybe that makes it more safe for him. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I should just be happy that they prioritized him being in touch with his feelings over being a hard as nails soldier guy. You may have convinced me that I thought too hard about it. And Ethan says he also would expect that same reaction, but that those people compartmentalize, which again, that is a thing that will come up. I'm a fan of spy fiction. That's a thing that comes up in spy fiction. We just compartmentalize our life. So no, we don't. Well, we do, but spies do it professionally so that they can deal with these very difficult situations, and that you would expect the same thing from special ops. I like that he's a person more in touch with his feelings. I don't know if that scene works 100% for me. I just don't know that he would do that in front of Diana. But it definitely gives a great opportunity for Diana to have compassionate feelings for him. Susie brings up the Amazon understanding of technology. The line that Philippus says, this was confusing to me also. Philippus says that Steve's plane can be made whole and taught to return home. Taught is a strange choice of words. I agree. That's another thing. Later on, I forget exactly where it is, but you see them fixing the plane, and they're doing it with these like geometric shapes that are also making it invisible, when everything up till now we've seen, and we'll see again, we see forges, we see swords, and the swords don't look particularly impressive. They seem to almost have cracks in them in some way, or nicks or cuts. I mean, I don't know how detailed I'm supposed to take for this. All of the technology still looks very old, except that there's one panel where somebody looks like they're pushing in the first issue, there's a panel where someone looks like they're pushing a cart that has no wheels. Is that because it's floating like Star Wars style, or is it just an oversight? And then all of a sudden they have the technology for fixing this plane and teaching it something, making it something like a living being. And Kate asks, would they have a word for programmed? I mean, I guess that's the question, right? Like if they have the capability to teach technology, what we would say program technology, to do a job, I like the use of the word taught instead of programmed because it shows a different mindset, right? Maybe a more feminine or softer mindset. But yeah, combined with the inconsistent way that they deal with technology, I feel Susie's on the right track when she says it's a weird intrusion of magic. That's how I felt about healing Steve. It's how I feel about the plane. It's just a real question. And it makes me wonder if that's another place that the art and the story didn't quite mesh up. In his mind was Greg Rucka imagining Amazons that had more technology, influenced by their original Greek culture, but should have been more technologically advanced, and that just didn't get through the script to Nicola Scott. I mean, that's a question that I've been wondering. Yeah, so we don't know what it means for things to have happened at the gate, but clearly it's important because now a champion must be chosen, armed with the perfect, and sent to return Steve home. He is apparently a key. He is apparently very important to the gods because he crashed on the island. Erato worries for her sister among men, but Castalia thinks that men should watch out for the only Amazon. And kind of like Philippus and the gun, I feel like Erato has the better argument here. The reading of the text seems to want Castalia to have won the point. And clearly, Amazons are very capable, and she's going to go to a place where she gets named Wonder Woman. But at the same time, you don't know any of that. And dealing with that sisterhood and being separated, I feel like Erato probably makes a better call. We find out that every Amazon would volunteer, but Hippolyta doesn't feel like she can ask anyone to, because that would be forfeiture of their immortality and banishment from the island. They could never return. Philippus and Hippolyta talk about Diana as though she will definitely win. And I have a question there. Have we been shown enough to believe that? Or are we just being told something? We haven't really seen Diana excel specifically in a way that makes us think beyond a shadow of a doubt she will be the winner of the games. Or at least I didn't feel like that. We saw her train a little bit. We see her shoot the 2 arrows. But I don't know. This felt like it was very informed as opposed to demonstrated. Then we have a moment of Diana and Hippolyta speaking about the games and Steve. Diana wants to see the best in him, and through him, the best of man's world. It is naive, and we know it, or do we? This is some of my question of how are we supposed to feel about Steve Trevor? Diana is clearly a woman who understands duty. Hippolyta appreciates that and is proud of her, but also obviously very sad. Hippolyta gives a speech while armor and symbols and things are being made and the plane is repaired. I have this speech, this quote in my notes because I thought it was very powerful. I really liked it. She says that the games will choose our gift to the world of men. She will be our ambassador. She will speak with our voice, not just as protector of the Amazons, but as defender of all who dwell beyond our shores. She will leave us her home, her friends, all she has ever known. She will leave her immortality. She will never return. This will be her sacrifice, and ours too. Themyscira's gift to the world. Guys, I gotta tell you, that really stirred my heart. I don't know how I feel about the rest of the origin making that have the weight inside the story that it ought to, but me bringing all of my Wonder Woman stuff to it, and especially bringing the movie with me, like I liked that the clash between Diana and Hippolyta in the movie, and where Diana has to set herself apart, like she grows up, to do the thing. But I gotta tell you, I really like this philosophical idea of what it is that the Amazon who goes to man's world is giving up, but what she represents. I thought it was amazing. Kate suggests that if the reader were sure Diana would win, then the games would be less compelling, so they held her capability back for the sake of the story they wanted to tell. Okay, you bring up an interesting point, Kate. That is a compelling argument, depending on who your audience is, right? Like, clearly Diana is the hero of this story, and I don't know how many people came to this story not realizing that Wonder Woman is also Princess Diana of Themyscira. Is there a space where we wouldn't have realized Diana was going to win? It's the Hoosiers question. Well, we're watching a movie about these kids. They're probably going to win the big game. It's not that question that gives me the tension as I watch the movie. It's the way the story is put together. Or not. Maybe you're right on. Maybe we were supposed to be more concerned about Diana's ability to win the contest. That's an interesting point that I had not thought of, because again, I show up here knowing that Princess Diana is going to be Wonder Woman. So then there are games, and 3 Amazons make it to the finals. As an aside, I kind of super wish that some of these games that they had included written tests, like ethics or rhetoric. Again, I'm a little confused about what we're supposed to feel about the Amazons and their job, in the wider world. Similarly, I'm confused by the choice to spend 3 whole pages blocking bullets, but then we don't actually get to see Diana do it? What? I don't know. That was a really weird choice. Then we get a bunch of pomp and circumstance, and Steve can't stop talking. There's a part of me that wants to declare that he's mansplaining to the air, but, I'll be nice. But then there's also an invisible plane, which I love, because as much as I understand wanting Wonder Woman to fly like Superman, I also really like the invisible plane. Then we get a reveal of Wonder Woman in her armor, and it's pretty sweet. I really like this version of her in costume or in armor. The perfect is bestowed upon her, and I really liked this quote as well. Its strength is as true as the heart who wields it. And Diana's answer is, for all my people, I will use it with wisdom and with love. That's hot stuff, you guys. That's some real Wonder Woman stuff for me. We then have a tearful goodbye and entering of the plane. This is one place where Nicola Scott's facial expressions really spoke to me. They're all looking up as the plane leaves, and Hippolyta is worried for her daughter. Philippus is worried for her sister. And Castalia is hopeful, while Erito stands stoically. I got to be honest with you, because we're going to talk about story questions. I don't love the way that this thing comes together, but those last few panels really make me want to sort of retroactively like it more. They really stick to the landing, as far as I'm concerned. A few story questions and issues, and I'm running a little long, so I'm going to run through these pretty fast, and instead of talking about them now, I'm going to ask that we have the discussion in Discord or with the hashtag or whatever, and I'll kind of address some of what we come up with at the beginning of the next session. This version of Wonder Woman's origin literally starts with Steve Trevor. How do we feel about that decision? I'm not a big fan on principle, but I'm curious to see what you guys think. The Amazon backstory is decidedly unclear. Does that make it more interesting? Does it make it a mystery? Or does it make it an intellectual puzzle for us to backfill? Or is it just needlessly confusing? What are their origins? Who are their key patrons? These things seem like an opportunity to declare an Amazon thesis statement, but I don't feel like we get one. So if you guys feel like we do, let me know. But I feel like these were all opportunities to discuss that, and we left it sit. Imagine the difference, for instance, between declaring that they are their patrons, their chief patrons are Athena and Aphrodite versus Ares and Harmonia. These are big differences. What is the gate? What's their collective duty? How are they failing at it? Big questions, right? The art is beautiful, but does it do the entire job that we need it to do? Going back to one of the problems of the movie, there are very few Amazons of color shown. Philippus is one of them, and she's prominent, but in the crowd scenes and stuff, we just don't get it. I don't get that racial diversity that I would like to see in the art. Another example, Steve mentions he's a big guy, that the clothes are just too big for him, but the Amazons don't generally look that much larger than him on the page. Their style's obviously influenced by ancient Greece, but it also seems like they haven't progressed much. There's forges and swords and shields and bows and arrows, but their medicine seems miraculous, and they have technology for invisible self-flying jet. Do you feel like some more obvious technological advancement in the background, making their lives simpler, would have done something for that? Do we prefer Amazons that are still living in a very Bronze Age situation? Is there anything for us to make of the biblical imagery of the evil tree and the viper in paradise? Are we perhaps supposed to equate Ares and Satan? From a big storytelling situation, does the juxtaposition of Steve and Diana work? Do we see their individual journeys complementing one another, or are we drawing out deeper meanings than are obvious? And the reason I ask this is because Steve takes up a lot of the air in the room of this story, and I'm not sure that I personally see the point to it. The stuff that we see doesn't really make me care about him personally. or think that he's particularly interesting in his own right. Now, again, I showed up here, just like you guys, with the movie in my head where Diana is clearly front and center and the most important thing going on at all, even when Steve's around. So did that poison me for this version of Steve? Do I not like how much Steve is in this because I came here with some other expectations? Or is this a legitimate problem? It seems that the story real estate, to me, again, I'm talking this as a writer, I would personally have rather spent more time on Diana's relationships on the island, her competency, or the Amazon backstory, or even what the gate is, than I would have spent that time on Steve and his friend and him being a godfather and all this other stuff. This is some of what I'm talking about. This is 2 pages out of the story. I'm just a little unclear, right, on what we're doing here. Like, again, we're supposed to juxtapose the development of Steve and Diana, but I'm not clear on it. So we start in one place and they're drinking and feasting together, and Steve is apparently drinking in a bar. I can see those two complementing one another, right? But then we transition to Diana training with weapons. Again, we're shown some of her competency, and that's really cool. But then we step over here, and I think that the thing that ties these two together is the fact that they're training. The SEALs are training. But then I'm not sure. Maybe this one with the SEALs, where they're going into water, is supposed to go with this one of Diana coming out of the water. I'm just not sure. And part of the reason I'm not sure is what they're talking about, where she says, one of the other Amazons says, she emerges like Aphrodite. God, she's killing me. Is she attracted to her? I guess. The response is, I thought she and Kazuya cuts her off. And Megara and, I'm sorry, my resolution isn't good enough. I can't read everybody's names. But she lifts off a couple of Amazons and says, I don't even know. This slut-shaming Princess Diana, who will be Wonder Woman, seems like a weird choice, but I also literally cannot read that panel any other way. Because they're talking about her in a romantic relationship, it makes me wonder if this panel is also supposed to be shared, like juxtaposed and connected to this panel of Nick getting married, except that's more about Nick than it is about Steve, so I'm confused there. And it's also a religious ceremony, which so is this religious ceremony of the Amazons. And then we get Steve doing a faraway look while his friends talk about war. I think is supposed to, this one is the most clear to me, is juxtaposed with them talking about the Amazons going to their games, which I think we're supposed to equate with war, but it doesn't quite seem right with me. But regardless, that's what they're talking about. The Amazons are talking about, while Diana stares wistfully off into space like Steve. I feel like these 2 pages are indicative of some of the storytelling problems that I see. You get these panels juxtaposed so closely together, and you think you can see the thread that ties them together, but I can't be 100% sure about it. There's just enough ambiguity or confusion, or honestly, in the case of at least one panel, extremely problematic content, that I'm just a little confused about what we're supposed to learn about Diana and Steve compared together. I am happy that they made Diana's queer sexuality canon, but don't we feel like, rather than a slut-shaming panel, maybe she gets a tearful goodbye with her lover as well as her mother when she's leaving Themyscira? I don't want to be too negative. I really enjoyed these issues overall. They were a good reading experience, but the more that I dug into the details, the more confused I became. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm set up to enjoy the rest of Diana's origin story. I'm set up to enjoy the rest of year 1, but I'm also left a little confused about what things I am supposed to take from this part of the story on into the next part of the story. And I'm very interested to hear what you all think about that as well. Look for me on Twitter at Joshua Unruh and use the hashtag SHUWonder. That's for Superhero University Wonder. And we can continue that conversation as we go. And we will return next week to look at the next few issues of Wonder Woman Rebirth Year 1. Thank you all very much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
Superhero University is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions.